Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Payton Tontz of New Paradigm Psychology, bringing you my June 2020 video of my monthly series, and this one is called Claiming Our Freedom as a Sovereign Being. Alright, let's just take one breath together, just breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth, just letting it all go. Okay, so just doing a little bit of brief recap here. All the videos that I've been doing this year so far, as I look back, have all been really about the teachings on the nature of the essential self. So I don't plan these videos out. My commitment to myself this year was that I would just intuitively follow the topics that come to me creatively that I want to do a video on, and I'm committed to letting that just kind of be organic and intuitive. And so it's interesting now to look back and see that basically every month from a different angle is looking at the essential teachings on the nature of the self, the non-dual self. And so I've been kind of looking at that from different angles. Now the last two videos, though, there's been a theme it's been more developmental. So I've been kind of establishing and building each month on the previous month's video. So today's video is following that trend, and I'm going to be building very much on the past 2 months' videos, where I first talked about the teachings on the nature of the essential self. I brought in the Advaita Vedanta tradition specifically, and then last month I talked about the alchemy of transformation that takes place when we discover the nature of the essential self, and we differentiate between that essential self and our human mind and body, and that catalyzes a process of transformation that ultimately is a shift of paradigms in the psyche, from a paradigm that's based on a self-identity that is rooted in more the ego self, more the being identified with the mind and body as one, to a paradigm of the identity of who we are being rooted in this essential self. And this theory is based on the idea that our psyche really is rooted around the core principle of identity of the self, right? So our whole kind of human organism is organized around the basic central principle of our identity, of who we are. Okay, so this month's video is building on that, and I'm going to be continuing to look at these two paradigms, the paradigm that we move from, of unconsciousness, of being identified with the ego self, to the paradigm of being rooted in the essential self, and I'm going to build and expand on that, focusing on the process as one of liberation, and so let's just take a look at that for a second now. And I'm going to draw a little bit here on the Sanskrit just to root this in the teachings of Advaita Vedanta once again, the language that they use. So what they talk about is that the state of being identified with the ego self is the state of bondage, and the state when we root ourselves in our identity in the essential self is the state of liberation. So the whole process of spiritual awakening, of self-realization, what they call gaining self-knowledge, is a process of moving from the state of bondage to the state of liberation. But it's not we're in state A and then all of a sudden we're in state B. No, that's not how it works, unfortunately. It's a process. It's a process of excavating and deconstructing a whole mind and body and nervous system and belief system and brain and body structure rooted in that whole system, and rebuilding and rewiring ourselves into a whole new brain and body and human being. Okay, so let's look at this, going back to the Sanskrit. So bondage is coming from the word bandha, which is the Sanskrit word that means to bind. Okay, so that's where this word bondage comes from, and I think it's a powerful word because it really expresses the state of bondage for what it is. It's a state of being bound. It's a state of being identified with the human mind and body that is limited and is subject to suffering and pain and death and so forth. And the state of liberation is what they call moksha. That's the Sanskrit word for being liberated. Okay, so we can see this quite simply as a state of being bound. And when we wake up to the nature of our self, this essential self, which is inherently free, when we discover what it is, it's inherently free in the sense that it's whole unto itself. It exists in a timeless realm. So it's not connected to time or form, which are the two. Time, space and form are kind of in the same realm. So it exists beyond the limits of time and space. It's eternal in that sense. So it's unbound, it's limitless. And there's so many different ways I could go into describing the limitless nature, all the different ways that it's limitless. But just following the logic of it here. So if we discover that who we really are is this limitless self that is inherently free, is inherently unbound, is inherently infinite potential, which is infinite creative possibility and creative power, then we can see why the process is called a process of gaining liberation and gaining freedom from bondage. So that's the whole archetype of spiritual awakening is really spelled out in a beautiful, simple way here, right? We're liberating ourselves from a state of bondage, and we're reorganizing ourselves and rewiring our whole systems into a state of living as a liberated being, as a truly free human. Okay, so I thought this was exciting the way it came through, because we're just about to experience the 4th of July here in the United States, and I think this topic is very relevant to our current situation. And so I'm excited to bring this message forward in that sense, as the blueprint for this country itself, I believe, is rooted in this concept of true human freedom and liberation. And my hope is that we will be able to continue to realign with that and really understand what it means, and to heal and embody that as a country. Okay, so let's look now at what the state of bondage is, what the state of liberation is, and just break this down a little bit more. Okay, so when we're in the state of bondage, as I've talked about in previous videos, we really are living in a state of unconsciousness, and we're operating out of an unconscious state of conditioning. So as we grow up and develop through our unique individual experience in our own family and in whatever cultural context we've grown up in, We are conditioned, we are programmed. Literally, our nervous system, our belief systems, our perceptions, and all of that are very much programmed by the imprints that we've internalized about ourselves and the world, you know? That conditioning has really, in a simple way, it has two different layers to it. The one is the personal layer. So we have our personal ancestry, our personal, family history, or whatever our unit of family or caregiving that we had, that unique, intimate environment that we grew up in as a child, our primary caregiving relationships. That kind of really is a big part of our unique individual conditioning, and whatever traumas and wounds uniquely took place on that very personal individual level. The other level, which I feel actually gets a lot less attention and needs a lot more attention, is the cultural conditioning. Okay? So if you think about the next ring out of the individual intimate family unit, is the culture in which that individual family unit exists, right? So whatever that environment is for the parents that are then, that the children are inheriting their worldview and all of it from, the parents are channeling that. The parents, as far as they have that cultural conditioning, whatever their cultural conditioning is, it could be, immigrant parents from another country who are then in a new country, and so that's a unique cultural conditioning, right? Or it could be, whatever the situation is. But the parents are, through their individual parenting and the messages that they're giving to their children, part of that is whatever their own collective cultural conditioning is, that's coming through them in the way that they're relating to the child, and the way they're answering all the questions that the child asks about what is this and what's the world and why this and that. So now in this day and age, so we have the cultural conditioning coming through the parenting or the caregiving, but then we also have it through the experience that the child has growing up, right? So in school, primarily at the beginning, in school, the child is then really getting the cultural conditioning outside of the home, more from the culture at large and whatever the education system is. And then nowadays, with all the media that we have social media, we have the internet, we have all this other information that that's available to us, and that's being pumped and projected out to us through all these different mediums, the television, social media, the internet at large. So there's a whole lot of exposure to messaging from the collective culture. And as we've just gone through, especially over the last, 30 years, that layer of conditioning, of messaging, that then lends itself to the conditioning is quite profound. It's quite profound. And it's underestimated how much of an influence that has on our self-identity and our worldview of others and of the world at large. The power of images and all the different ways that media, through advertising, through all the different methods, but the messages that come through like television or video, they're very there's a lot of subliminal messaging that's been started from when we were very young. And so I wanted to just take a couple moments to really emphasize this part of it, because I think even in the spiritual teachings and communities and talking about spiritual awakening, this layer of conditioning and bondage is very rarely talked about in any, in any depth or really given attention. And I experience a lot of people who are very awake spiritually, or awake to this essential self, done a lot of awakening psychologically and spiritually, but and even done a lot of personal healing, but yet still appear in my eyes anyway to not have addressed these deeper layers of conditioning and really gone through that whole layer of waking up and really being a free and sovereign being, a free thinker. And so when we look at the paradigm in the psyche rooted in bondage, again, there's multiple layers to that need to be brought to consciousness and brought up for questioning and discernment, and just brought up to be aware. And the reason why I've again emphasized the cultural conditioning, because that also can include the deeper beliefs that we have, the deeper truths about our worldview, right? About what's real. In terms of even physics, right? The laws of what are the real laws that govern our experience so it's on every level. It's on every level, and it also very much includes our religious, potential religious beliefs or spirituality, however that is for people. But this cultural conditioning that I'm talking about really includes a lot of our belief systems that are really fundamental. So, and I'm not saying that everything that you realize that you've internalized as a belief is going to be false, but that everything needs to at least be reviewed, right? At least be brought up. Otherwise, anything that stays unconscious is you're just still living in that default mode of operating as if that thing were true, until and unless everything has been seen, which is a process. It's an unearthing. It's a, it takes time. It takes a lot of devotion to this process. But until those core layers of the cultural conditioning have been seen for what they are and brought up for discernment and review, we're still going to be living in a default mode. Okay, so let's now shift and look at, so what does the state of liberation look like, right? So we are deconstructing, we're bringing to consciousness all the different conditioned beliefs, culturally at large, personally, individually, in our own ancestral lineages, our own family of origin. And we are, as we recognize and we're realigning with ourself as this essential, pure conscious being that is inherently whole and free from death, that is reliable and secure. It's a secure base in ourselves that's preemptive to the mind and body, and that gives us this solid sense of foundation in the center of our experience to allow this process of transformation to take place, to allow ourselves to, in any given moment, just stop and just rest in that presence and help the nervous system, help the body and mind resource, and to provide the mind a home base where it can rest in that. It doesn't have to have all the answers. It doesn't have to understand it all those things, right? So this shift again is such a healing process for the psyche. And then as we do that, and we more and more recognize that and are able to rest in the truth of that more and more often, we're able to start to let go of the conditioning, to see it when it arises, and to begin living more and more of the time in a state of enlightenment, you would call it, enlightenment, liberation. And the word that I'm bringing forward here, which isn't based in Advaita Vedanta, is sovereignty. Okay, and that's where I'm going next. So what does it mean to live in this liberated state? So basically is that the truth of the essential self, as I've said, is free, is infinite potential. It's the source really of what we call creativity, the source of creation, right? Imagination. The capacity to imagine comes from the fact that our essential self, who we really are, is pure imagination, right? It's pure potential for creativity, for imagination. Imagination is creativity, right? So the nature of the self being that, right, automatically the more that we are rooted in that as who we are, the more we experience ourselves as being free, because the nature of that self is inherently free, and we can connect with that in any moment. But as far as our human mind and body and brain and what it looks like to be living more in this liberated state on that level, it's really about being a free thinker, being a critical thinker, being able to use our own discernment to determine what we believe to be true. And as we navigate through everyday life, we're constantly, faced with information, faced with, situations personally and in our work. And we're discerning what's going on here. We're, making choices. We're constantly navigating the field of experience. And when we're living in an awake state, we're very much using that internal capacity to discern all the time. And so instead of when we're living in a state of bondage, in a conditioned state, we are just reacting. We're in a more we just kind of react. We, oh yeah, this is what I believe, and oh, I know how to deal with, yeah, I know what this, we're very much in a more rigid, collapsed version of reality, just because our beliefs are rigid, and we kind of are just living unconsciously and reacting to things from that unconscious state. Whereas when we're awake, we're able to experience whatever it is, to witness it, to take that in, and to go through a process of discernment about what we believe about that, and how we want to respond, and how do we actually think about that. And that is actually a creative process. When we are awake, the act of living life is creative, because we are responding and living in a creative state, right? We're an alive being that is natural, is responding, has a natural kind of creative response and intelligence that just comes from the state of being connected with ourselves, connected with our own capacity for discernment and truth. And a part of this is actively being engaged in what we believe to be true, what our beliefs are, what do we know, what do we know that we don't know. So it's really living in a state of being a free thinker, inner wisdom, intuition. So it's really living from our own hearts, and being plugged into and tuned into ourself as this infinite creative self as our as where we are rooting our identity in. And out of that comes, sometimes we're surprised even by what comes, right? Because it can be spontaneous and it's creative. It's not pre-scripted. It's alive. It's awake. And then the other part of it is cultivating our unique gifts and capacities, right? So that can be whatever. It can show up in so many different ways for different people. But we each have our own innate gifts to offer in whatever form they take. It could be even just in the form of taking care of family members. It could be in the form of, playing an instrument, and all the metaphorical ways we can think of what an instrument is, right? It could be dancing. It could be just channeling your own energy through a particular platform. It can look in so many different ways, but I think when we're living in this more free, liberated state, it's not that we then just kind of, go through life in this kind of neutral, like, oh, everything's fine. No, like we're a human being, we're actually even more engaged in life. And we have our unique self to experience and to offer and to, participate in the world. Okay, so now why do I call this, why do we use the word sovereignty here? Okay, so the word sovereignty is literally to reign over oneself, right? To be a sovereign being is to reign over oneself as one's own kingdom or queendom. So a sovereign being is a person that knows themselves. They know who they are at a core spiritual level, but also as a human being, knowing oneself. And as I said, it's not that we just go from a state of bondage to all of a sudden like a fully realized self-mastery person that's fully self-mastered sovereign being. It's a process, and so the more that we become conscious of the conditioned self and do our healing and integration, the more we are able to live in this awakened state and really align with what it is to be a sovereign being, and to just be awake in the whole process. So in order I don't have to be a fully realized in my full sovereign self all the time to say that I'm an awakened person, right? I can be aware of the ways that of where my challenges still are and when I get triggered and all of that. It's not a black and white thing. It's a process. But I can say that I am committed and conscious in the process because I've woken up enough, I'm aware enough, right, of myself, including the places where I'm still in bondage and the places where I know that I'm free, and I can just engage in that process. Okay, so I think that says it all for now. I hope that you find this helpful, and I feel that these videos are going to take an interesting turn. I feel like this one kind of completes this 6 months, the first half of 2020, and I'm feeling like in the second half we're going to move in some new interesting directions, focusing a little more on relationships and the psychological aspect of things, and we'll see what comes. But hope you find this helpful, and I will see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.